Good afternoon and welcome to this lunchtime webinar hosted by the APM South East Branch and the Rail Safety Standards Board, the RSSB. We're joined today by Jane Dobson, Portfolio Head at RSSB, who will take us through the project that considered how Network Rail could best ensure the safety of our railways while also protecting wildlife and preserving trees. Jane is joined by John Varley and also by Dr. Neil Strong, who she will introduce to you. And they will take us through how this project was implemented. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll have some time at the end of the presentations to go through the questions. And Jane, if I can hand over to you.
Certainly, thank you for that, Jackie. And thank you to everybody who's taken the effort to and time to join us for this webinar. I know you've all got very busy schedules, so it's much appreciated. And a massive thank you really to APM, to Jackie and to Rob Allen and to Catherine Bendel for making this all happen. So the aim of this particular webinar is to tell you about a particular project where effective stakeholder engagement was absolutely crucial. We've divided the webinar into 3 sections. So we'll kick off with John looking about the actual project itself and the background to that. Then I'll talk about the challenges we had with engaging with stakeholders over a really short period of time with different conflicting interests. And finally, we'll pass over to Neil, who will talk about the perspective from Network Rail and actually what happened after we had delivered the report. So first of all, perhaps I could kick off with introductions. So as Jackie said, I'm Portfolio Head at Rail Safety and Standards Board. Rail Safety and Standards Board is a railway membership organisation, and we develop the safety standards and research for the railway industry. I work within the Projects Directorate. We manage about 200 projects, and I manage the delivery particularly of the research and standards projects. So if I could hand over to John and Neil to introduce themselves before we kick off for the presentation, and then there will be time for questions and answers at the end. So over to you, John, for introducing yourself.
Thank you very much, Jane. John Varley. I'm the chair of the review, or was the chair of the review. My day job is director of Clinton Devon Estates, which is a 10,000 hectare, 25,000 acre rural estate in Devon.
Thanks, John. My name's Neil Strong. I am Biodiversity Strategy Manager with Network Rail in the Technical Authority part of Network Rail, and I was the lead contact for John during the review in 2018.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you, Neil. I'm going to switch my camera off now and then pass over to John to talk about the origins of the project.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. So the slide there says clarity, purpose and relationships, and I think those for me are the 3 key components of how I viewed my journey on this project: getting clarity, getting a common purpose, and building and maintaining relationships through what was a very relatively short period of time. I'm not a railway person. I'm not actually a project management person, and neither am I a tree person. So it's quite interesting when I come on to how all this started for me. Throughout the journey, though, I have gone through a metamorphosis from tolerating project managers and knowing you had to have one, to actually really valuing professional project management and recognizing the importance of embedding quality project management into really everything you do in life as well as business. And so this has been a transformative experience for me, to say the least. So, so first of all, I've never chaired a government review before. I've sat on a few, including, you may have heard of the Independent Review of Forestry, which Caroline Spellman, the Secretary of State then for DEFRA, initiated after she was seen to be about to sell off most of the nation's forests, and there was a big kerfuffle. So I sat on that with the Bishop of Liverpool, and I was also with Sir John Lawton on the Space for Nature, looking at linking nature networks, wildlife networks across the country in 2010, and it's taken 10 years, and now we're looking to do it as we leave the European Union. So it's quite exciting stuff, but I've not actually chaired anything. However, I have observed what went on during the time I spent on these reviews. And the first one was to get clear terms of reference from the very beginning, to have a good secretariat, as they call them. I now call it a good project management team. And talking about teams, to ensure around you, you're surrounding yourself with the best possible people and advisors. The other lesson I learned from my previous experiences before this one was pace, the importance of pace and momentum. And most importantly, managing stakeholders. That's something which throughout all their experiences on panels and reviews, stakeholder management is critical. And the other thing I learned by the fact we didn't do it in previous ones was follow-up, to actually go back and check that people actually followed up on the recommendations that you've proposed. That's something which isn't commonplace in many government reviews. So in late May in 2018, I was minding my own business in the boardroom of my office, and somebody put a yellow post-it note on the desk to say, would you mind giving the minister a call? I had no idea which minister it was, but when I rang, it was Joe Johnson, Boris Johnson's brother, who asked me if I'd like to chair this review called the Network Rail Vegetation Management Review. It was a catchy title, something which really drew me into the conversation. And within 5 minutes conversation with Joe Johnson, I realized this was a completely impossible task. The main reason for the review, as Jane will explain shortly, was that some Network Rail were caught felling trees at the side of the railway line for safety reasons during the bird nesting season. They weren't just caught by anybody, they were caught by somebody who dobbed them to the Guardian newspaper. So this was becoming a fairly toxic political issue, which was growing arms and legs in the press. And I was suddenly realized that I was dealing with a rather passionate group of individuals who liked trees. The other thing was the polarized positions between the railway, Network Rail, which is a machine bureaucracy looking after 20,000 miles of railway track, and been very focused and professional at doing that. It's one of the safest railways in Europe because of their approach to not just maintaining trees at the side of the railway line, but also all the other work they do with signalling and track maintenance. And the other element of the polarization was single issue NGOs, some specifically to do with trees and some more broadly based wildlife organizations. It struck me that these two polarized positions couldn't be reconciled. And the third reason it was impossible was I was told he wanted a review completed in 6 weeks. I had a week to think about it, and I did think about it a lot. And eventually, because I like a challenge, I said yes. I then took 3 weeks to negotiate the terms of reference with the Department of Transport. Every hour, my only advice or reflection back on this is every hour you spend getting the terms and reference right saves you at least 10 hours later on trying to go back to them and change them or adapt them. So I spent quite a lot of time, 3 weeks in fact, talking to civil servants and back to the minister to try and change what I felt at the very beginning were not quite the terms of reference that were needed for this project. Also, the timescale, which was insane. I hadn't met the RSSB team at that stage, but I renegotiated that to October, which was a big ask because the minister was facing a lot of pressure from the cabinet, or from the cabinet and other political parties, political players about sorting this issue out. And of course, we were on our way to another bird nesting season, spring the following year, so they wanted answers. I was told I had the RSSB to support me in this role. I'd never heard of the RSSB, but it's the Rail Safety Standards Board, a remarkably fine professional body. I would say that now. At the time, I had no idea they were that. And they look after all safety and policy standards for the railway. and they provided me with not just a secretariat, but a project management machine, which I'd never come across in my life before. And in July, I was announced. If you could just flick on to the next slide, please. That's the cover of the report. I always believe with a report like this, you need a good cover. There it is. And I'll come back to that later. The next slide, please. So I mentioned the RSSB, and in working with them, my immediate thought this project is going to need some serious managing. Even with a 6-month time frame to October from July, or from July to October, less than 6 months, I needed this properly managing, and I was blessed by the RSSB's fine project management. I also need some clarity. I needed a common purpose, and also understand what was the problem we were trying to solve. It wasn't trees, strangely enough, although everybody initially thought it was. It was about understanding, it was about communication, and it's about value, what you actually value. So here is a picture, black and white picture from 1950 of Gunnersbury Tunnel and a lovely steam engine going along it. And if you look carefully, you will see some trees, but they're not at the side of the railway line. They're further off in the hedgerows and beyond. So all the way up from Stephenson's rocket, all the way up to the formation of the introduction of diesel trains, there weren't many, if any, trees at the side of the railway line. And there was a reason for that, because the idea was to keep railway track bed and the either side of the railway clear of vegetation, because with the steam train, it can catch fire. And so the railway organisation of the time, British Rail, spent lots of money and lots of time valuing what was going on at the side of the railway. They valued vegetation management as an operational area, and they cut down and in some cases burnt the vegetation at the side of the railway. The result was a remarkable specialised flora and fauna growing at the side of the railway. And even today, there is specialised scientific research into the unique railway flora which grows inside at the track side and in between the track. So, you know, we are in an interesting place now where if I showed you a photograph, and I don't have one, of a railway track today, you will see, and if you travel on the train, you will see many trees and vegetation at the side of the railway. History shapes the present and informs the future. So looking at that, you would think there's not any biodiversity, but actually there's more biodiversity there than there probably is on a track side covered in trees. Next slide, please. And there we are. There is some trees, not quite to the extent I wanted to show you, but that's a classic trackside with trees. So it was a whole new world for me. And I decided I needed to get to know it. So I asked the Network Rail if they could give me a trip in a cab, a trip on a train. And they did better than that. They gave me my own train. I had it for a day, and I travelled around the north of England on it. I had my own timetable, which amazed a huge amount of train spotters who saw this unusual configuration travelling around the north of England. It was a fantastic opportunity to look at the issue on the ground or on the track, and it stopped every so often, and we got various members of Network Rail teams to join and have conversations as we went round. So whilst the RSSB set up the project, I got on the phone, and as well as planning a railway journey, met with all the major stakeholders we could think of. Civil servants in both the Department of Transport and also civil servants in the Department of Environment. They didn't know anything about this project when in the Department of Environment, but they did shortly after I met them. And just that in itself was fascinating, looking at how departments work or don't work between each other. And I spent a bit of time trying to get the Department of Transport to talk to the Department of Environment, which proved valuable later on. I contacted the chair of Network Rail, Sir Peter Hendy, and with trepidation went to see him, and he was remarkably on side, very generous with his time, and his resources. And later, the new chief executive, Andrew Haynes, joined in the middle of the project, and he likewise was very generous with his time. And I spent time on the phone, emails, and phone calls with these two individuals to ensure that they engaged and their teams engaged and understood the project as it developed. Fortunately, with my day job, I had connections with quite a lot of the green NGO chief executives, the RSSB, the Woodland Trust, Butterfly Conservation, and a whole range of others, and spent a fair bit of time talking to them as well, and as well as the railway regulator, which is very similar to the health and safety executive. So picking up the phone and having coffee in the role I was in was instrumental in trying to build at least a consensus that we need to get a common purpose around getting the job done. Even if there were some quite polarized positions to begin with. I talked about getting on the ground and seeing the problem, as well as traveling around in my own train, which was a bit of fun, but also very valuable. I visited a place called Hadley Wood, where Network Rail contractors had got the locals to rise up in arms against them for what they perceived to be the damage and destruction caused by Network Rail. And I have to say it was a sight to behold what these contractors had done, and also meet those who love trees and biodiversity, both individuals and groups, but also some of the organisations behind them. The fact was that when you get beneath all this and you do this level of engagement and work with your stakeholders at the right level, you sometimes find that everybody sees it as an opportunity, or the majority do, and this was the case here. So whilst on the face of it, this was a very polarized situation, in the end, I had a lot of consensus at chief executive level, certainly, and stakeholder level, that we had a problem to solve. I also was keen to change the language from vegetation, which is a very strange word, and trees, which are very emotive. And I know from the work with the Bishop of Liverpool, the emotional aspects that the nation, this nation anyway, and certainly England, holds with its trees. And when the government tried to sell off the nation's forests, the concern and issues that caused were humongous. So I recognised if we didn't travel in the right direction with this, we'd be in the same place we were back then. So for me, it was about nature and about valuing nature. And that ended up being the strapline for our report. And once we started talking about nature and biodiversity, we moved the debate from trees to actually all the other things that are growing at the side of the railway line. And maybe then, are those trees the right trees in the right place? The other aspect was how in the 1950s and before then in the 1960s, Network Rail valued what was going on with the vegetation as worthy of an asset. They actually viewed it then as an asset. But since diesel trains came in and there was no need to manage the vegetation at the side of the railway track, that resource was allocated onto other aspects of the railway, not just about efficiency and saving money by reducing staff in this area, but reallocating them to other tasks. So the line side was never managed in the way it was before. And that, again, was one of the areas I was keen to focus on. Getting the vegetation, or as I say, the biodiversity at the side of the railway line viewed as an asset, the same as Network Rail viewed it as track and signalling as it was in the past. Next slide, please. So Jane and Neil will tell you about what we did. I set out in the end 6 recommendations. And one of them, the most important one in terms of getting the ball rolling, was with government. We needed a vision. We needed a vision from government. We also needed government to set out with Network Rail the objective of managing the railway line side for nature. And I knew that would be incredibly difficult to get government to do that. Equally, we had 5 recommendations for Network Rail. In my view, the opportunity for Network Rail was huge. To be relevant, both relevant to society, all the environmental and climate agendas that are flying past the window at the moment, Network Rail needs to, in my view, needs to embrace them and show leadership in delivering a railway for people and wildlife, not just the safest railway in Europe, but the greenest was my level of ambition I pushed to the chairman, Peter Hendy. And the other aspect I put in place was, after the report was handed over in October to the minister, in November, sorry, to the minister, in 2018, was I put in place a commitment to a review in 6 months' time to maintain momentum. I was delighted, if not actually surprised, that when I expected the government to be looking at changing policy in 3, 4, 5 years, they changed policy in 3 months. And on the slide there, you see network government sets out vision for safe and biodiverse railway line side. For me, that was a major shift in policy, and one which then unlocked a whole range of other stuff to support the recommendations for Network Rail to come in line. I don't know if how important it was. Maybe Neil could reflect. Next slide, please. On getting Network Rail to focus on the valuing nature on their railway. But here's a quote from Andrew Haines, the chief executive, who'd only been in post a few months. And as you can imagine, a man running a railway or just taking up the post of chief executive, quite a few things on his mind. And that quote there really is true. And it's not just words, because Neil will explain what they've done. So for me, it was a great result. We made a difference. I've been introduced to a whole new world of the railway and the commitments and challenges it faced, not least the safety issues. My journeys on trains, when I can do them now, have taken a whole dimension. But what made it successful was, as I said before, a strong team and professional project management, clear scope and timescales, effective and clear collaboration with stakeholders, resulting in engagement and commitment from different stakeholders, quality outputs and recommendations, being clear and concise and exciting. And that brings me to the book cover at the very beginning. When I sat around the table at the very beginning of all this project with about 15 people, 16 people from the RSSB, I said, we went round and they told me what their jobs were. And I turned to Jane and said, do you have a graphic designer? And they all looked at me as if it was a nutcase. I said, because at the end of the day, all my experience with government reports is exceedingly boring documents. And I wanted something that would end up on the coffee table of Network Rail and the minister. And so they didn't have one, but all credit to them, they got one. And we spent a little bit of time making sure that the graphic on the front met the RSSB standards and was technically correct, but equally brought to life what we were trying to do. And as a result of that, this document has gone far and wide, I'm sure, not just because of the cover, but also of the content. So I'd like to finish there and hand over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John. So why was stakeholder engagement so important in this project? So first of all, it was a politically sensitive project. As John has talked about the project, it was requested by the Department for Transport and indeed by the UK Transport Minister. So it was politically sensitive. We needed to deliver at pace. So within 3 months, we had short notice. Those 3 months were right bang in the middle of the summer. So the team weren't necessarily there and lined up, and external stakeholders, similar sort of thing. So there's some real issues there. And then finally, there was a wide range of stakeholders with apparent competing dilemmas. So you had the people that we would be dealing with were those that were managing the railway, you had those who were championing the natural environment, you had those for whom, such as general public, biodiversity is really, really important. So it was a case of looking at those competing dilemmas, and obviously at the end of the day, safety is absolutely right there at the top in terms of running this railway. But we had to take into account these different competing dilemmas. So John told us about the project and how it came about. Effectively, DFT had asked RSSB with John as an independent chair to consider how Network Rail can best ensure the safety of our railways while also protecting wildlife and preserving trees. So that was the objective of the work. In this area, you've got a lot of people who are really passionate about it. So if I tell you a little bit of a story about the results we got from the survey. So this was a project where a lot of stakeholders were highly passionate and setting their views. And this survey kind of demonstrates the level of passion of these people. So first of all, in terms of a survey, which is one of the methods we use to actually reach out to a wider number of people, just as kind of lessons learned, we only imagine there will be maybe 100 people who'd respond. But now with social media, you have to be careful that if you're doing a monkey survey, you might end up with far larger number of people. So almost overnight, we got something like 8,000 respondents, which kind of was a bit scary. So we had to get other people lined up to support us in analysing the results. So make sure if you are doing those monkey surveys that you have some really good, clear, structured, objective questions, which are easier to analyse. So just to give you an idea of the people who responded, so we got a wide range of respondents from the railway industry, but also general public, the public sector, community groups, environment groups. So it's quite a wide range of respondents. We asked a few questions, and I'm just going to pick out a few which are particularly relevant for this particular presentation about how we dealt with stakeholders. So the first one was, what aspect is most important to Network Rail's decision making in managing line-side vegetation? So the general view, obviously, that it's safety, which is right there at the top. Obviously, keeping trains on time, particularly by those people who work in the railway industry, that was kind of very important. And obviously, improving the environment and biodiversity and the impact on line-side neighbours was another one that came out from the respondents. Then we asked, how well do you think Network Rail manages line-side vegetation, the environment and biodiversity? Well, quite negative responses to that. It was the general view that it was poor, and there was a lot of concern around safety with vegetation not being removed, or maintaining the environment, or condemning Network Rail as being kind of all or nothing approach. So there was quite a lot of criticism about the way Network Rail managed their line-side vegetation. And then this one, what one word would you use to describe Network Rail's approach to vegetation management? You can see there's some pretty emotive words. There was a lot of animosity. There was a lot of negative feeling towards Network Rail, and we realised that this is something that we had to deal with head on. And the general view was that actually, while Network Rail might have been kind of managing a railway high performing and safe, they weren't taking as much respect as perhaps they should have been doing in the biodiversity field. So certainly that was the view of the general public, so, and also some communities and railway groups. If I just take to the next slide. So what do we need to get everybody on the same page and reach out our goal? So first of all, obviously we had to identify all the stakeholders, not only the positive ones, but also the negative ones. We had a wide range of stakeholders who would be interested. So you had either the general public, community groups, railway organisations, you also had the environmental groups. So there was a lot of people that we had to kind of reach out to. But we had to make sure that we didn't leave anybody out, because those people you leave out are usually the ones with the loudest voice. Then it was a case of focusing on those stakeholders who had the most power to help or hinder. So bearing in mind, you've got a lot of passionate people out there, you've got people within wildlife and who respect the countryside. We also had those people who, so the railways who were running, their priority was running trains on time and safely. So we focused on stakeholder groups, so wildlife organisations, conservation groups, and Network Rail, and we kind of approached the room through workshops and round tables and interviews. But it wasn't just kind of those individual stakeholder groups, because within those groups you also had diverging views. So even if you look at an organisation such as Network Rail, you had people constituted with large organisations who were very passionate about biodiversity, and those who are obviously passionate about running the railway on time. So it's kind of balancing all those out. We also focused on influential stakeholders. So obviously we consulted, as John mentioned, with the Chief Executive of Network Rail and the Chair of Network Rail, so Andrew Haynes and Peter Hendy, and obviously the Minister himself, although having said that, the two ministers, because one resigned while we were doing the work, which didn't help. So clarity over what we wanted from each stakeholder. So the stakeholders really needed to know what we wanted from them, particularly as we needed to deliver this project within 3 months. So we had to be really clear, and we did that through advanced information. So we provided advanced briefing notes, advanced briefing letters. We prepared structured questionnaires before we had any of the interviews, and obviously the advanced agendas for the series of workshops that we undertook. Connecting stakeholders' interest to your goals. So by connecting the stakeholders to our goals, we could generate really effective buy-in and really early on. So that was really important. So we reached out to people at a very, very early stage, recognizing we only had a few more weeks to go. And we got a lot of buy-in, even over the summer months. People were really engaged with it. So we had people who were mountaineering in the Alps or out in Japan who still contributed to the work that we were doing. So it was a really exciting piece of work from that point of view. And they really understood and got what we were trying to get at. Then the other thing I would point out is you can't deal directly with all stakeholders. So some of the most powerful and the loudest and the largest in numbers are really inaccessible. So we had to kind of look at other ways that we could access those people who had an influence. So either we approached individuals who could then influence within their organisations or influence up, or the survey worked extremely well for reaching a wider range of stakeholder groups. And finally, on this slide anyway, attain enough agreement to secure your goal. So not everybody has to agree, but as long as we're kind of heading for just enough to secure our goal, and the goal was obviously to develop a safe, high-performing railway which respected the environment. So through effective engagement, we reached out. We reached that agreement on the steps towards our goal. So essentially, through effective stakeholder engagement, we managed to, within those 3 months, review 100 documents, 5 roundtables. We did 40 interviews, 100 individuals were engaged, and over 8,000 survey responses. The 2 workshops, 2 cab rides that John mentioned, 1 day on the inspection train, and dealing with social media. And the team managed to get on holiday as well. So, we achieved quite a lot in a small space of time, but also prepared to be fluid. So for the survey, we thought there'd only be about 100 people, so we had 1 person lined up to analyse it. So we suddenly had to reach out to a few more, which kind of risked having an impact on the timescales. We also had to be fluid because once we were just about to deliver and press the button for the delivery of the report, there was the minister resigned, and we had to then approach another one to get the buy-in of the replacement minister. Also, as John mentioned, get the audience to sit up and take notice. We produced a really kind of flashy, attractive document, a coffee table type document, as John mentioned. We used punchy language, concise recommendations, and clear implementation steps with timescales and ownership of who should take that implementation forward. And above all, leadership and good team. And we all know this as project managers, absolutely key. And for this one, the reason why it was a success is because we had a very good team who had the right skills, the right capabilities, and we had a fantastic leader with John, who was leading it, who kind of could generate that excitement, both internally within the team, but also externally amongst the stakeholders. So they were kind of all working towards the same goal within a short space of time. And the result, well, we succeeded in 3 months in delivering a project to the satisfaction of our client, influencing government to introduce a specific policy on biodiversity, driving forward a commitment for Network Rail to take forward, and shifting DfT's targets from improved biodiversity to a net gain by 2040. So I think within that 3 months, through that team and through that leadership and through those different ways that we engaged, we succeeded we achieved quite a lot in that small space of time. So there's a link to the Varley report if you'd like to have a look at that. And I'm going to hand over now to Neil, who's going to tell us what happened next. Over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane, and John as well for the introduction. Yeah, just briefly again, so my role now is Biodiversity Strategy Manager, and you can see again using John's graphics there for my cover slide. So next slide, please, Jane. So John had mentioned the recommendations that we were set, and those are the 5 that came directly to Network Rail. And as he's run through looking at the organisation and how we deal with biodiversity, having that vision for where we want to go with the management of our estate, managing the estate as an asset and the line side and the environment that it's on, and also then working with not only our stakeholders and getting that communication right so that the work we do is the right work in the right place, but also making sure that we change the culture within the industry and within the business so that people recognise that we're not asking for extra activities on top of all the work that they're doing for the safety reasons, but actually this work can be done alongside it. And the way we've done that is to move from those recommendations into a number of programs that are looking at how we can manage the whole estate sustainably. And that's taking that vision and the standards and guides that we've been developing in the training. And I'll go through the points on the right-hand side as we step through my slides. So if you could have the next one, please, Jen. And key to a lot of this, John had talked about the really good relationship that he'd managed to get with Sir Peter Hendy, the chair, and also Andrew Haynes as the new CEO. And what we have worked on is with a number of organisations, making sure that the leadership throughout the business is able to understand sustainability, to be able to converse with the people that work with them and for them, so that we've got that not only the drive from the people on the ground, the frontline staff doing that work, but also the understanding for the leaders within Network Rail so that we can push this agenda forward. Next slide, please. And that drives us on to having that vision, to actually recognising that we do have a massive estate, 52,000 hectares of land going across all 3 of the countries in Britain. And to be able to manage that, we looked at the vision and developed the one that's on the front page of our biodiversity action plan that we published towards the end of last year. And as you can see, we're looking to have that estate that is managed not only for that safety and performance, which has been mentioned a number of times already, but also to look at the environment, to be aware of it, and to make sure we can work forward both with the customers, the passengers, and the freight operators who run trains on our network, but also those neighbours. There's 7 million people who back onto the railway and see what we do every day. Next slide, please, Jane. And in order to be able to do that, it's to provide the advice and the guidance to colleagues across the business so that they know what we need to achieve. And the document on the left-hand side is a new biodiversity standard that we've just published. And that provides the detail as to what is expected of the 5 regions across the network. And on the right-hand side is examples of the new guidance we're putting together, so that it puts the railway into the context of that type of management and possibly the different sorts of management that we need to do, so that not only can we move those trains up and down the network with the overhead power lines in place, but also to have the different habitats at the side of the railway and enable that slightly different management that might not have, I would say, traditionally been done, but as we saw from the black and white photo that John showed, it was done, and it's moving back to those novel techniques to be able to have those different sorts of habitats and to get the right habitat in the right place. And it's all about that guidance, that there will be places where the estate is wide enough and we can have the trees, but there are also a lot of locations where we need to work with lower growing vegetation, which, as John mentioned earlier on, is also very high in biodiversity. Next slide, please, Jane. And to accompany that guidance is to make sure that we have the capability and the capacity with colleagues across the network who know what they're looking at, but also who know who to go to for further advice if they need it. They know when to stop and how to stop safely so that they don't affect any of the legislation. And hopefully we have online training courses which we've developed, and hopefully when we're all out outside again, we'll be able to get colleagues around and we can have those really useful interactive discussions, actually being able to touch the environment that we're actually working on. Next slide, please. And in order to demonstrate to the business, one of the things that John had wanted to get out of the work we do was to have pilot and demonstration sites so that we can show people what is the art of the possible. And one of our pilots that's been going for the longest is down in Kent, and the two black lines on that image are the particular bits of the railway where we're doing these trial sites. And we've chosen those locations based on the fact that the vegetation in those locations was already posing a risk to the railway, and so work was going to be done there anyway. And what we've looked at is the way that the trees would have been managed and the sites, the ongoing maintenance then, and so changing those management techniques, so not only enabling us to achieve the objectives for the railway, but then also to be able to look at how we have adapted and managed the biodiversity at those locations as well. And that is an ongoing process, and what we're doing is learning from those trials and taking them forward, and actually already being able to take lessons learned from those trials and take them around the rest of the business. Next slide, please, Jim. One of the aspects of that is to change the way that we manage, as I say, the vegetation. So on the left-hand image, the red circle is just showing the reference point to the next photograph. Those trees on the right-hand side posing a lot of issues with not only the signals that's just on the left-hand side of the railway, but also the leaf fall and adhesion issues that we get during the autumn. So we knew we had to manage those trees. Traditionally, those would have been removed and everything would have gone back to the fence line. But what we've looked at is how we can retain the vegetation on the fence line, get back to that hedge on that boundary, so that we've got that demarcation, potentially use it as support to the fence that we've got there, but then manage the slopes slightly differently so that we can bring in the pollinator-rich habitats and get that into our estate and manage that accordingly. And with the guidance that we've got now, we can then take that forward and actually move into something there. One thing that we don't have, unfortunately, is those future photographs. We're very good. We've got the befores and afters now, but what we need to look at now is that ongoing maintenance to make sure that we can keep that going as we go forward to achieve our biodiversity targets. Thank you, Jane. Next one, please. And some of the lessons learned we heard throughout. One of the main reasons for the review in the first place was the impact of the vegetation management that we have and the questions that were coming from our neighbours. And it's all about the communication. And one thing that the pilot site did actually have was further complaints based on the work that they were doing. And what they did was develop a new system of actually documenting and showing people what work we were doing. And this has seen a real improvement in terms of the next phases of the trials. Have had no issues at all with our neighbours, because they can understand, they can see what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. Next slide, please, Jim. One of the key areas that we've seen, this is sort of around the change in the culture that we've seen over the last 2 years since John was involved in 2018. The sign on the right-hand side of this slide shows something that we're putting up around all the trial sites in Kent. And the excerpt from the email on the left is just to show that we had teams turning up to an emergency situation where there had been a landslide. They had seen the sign and they'd got in touch using the QR code to understand what the issues were at that location. And it's the sort of thing that possibly 2 years ago, possibly even less than that, that may not have happened, because we wouldn't have had the sign on site, and it would have just been a situation where there's an emergency on the railway, we need to do the work and we're going to do it now. We still did that emergency work, but we were also taking into account the biodiversity that was there. Next slide, please, Jane. And where we're going, and we've talked about building relationships and working with others, and we have started to work with a lot more people, and we're seeing these getting these relationships not only through events like the review workshops, where there was a number of organisations who came to feed into the review, but also we've ended up doing work with them, like the RSPB and the British Trust for Ornithology, in adapting our bird nesting protocols, but also since the work and since the ability of actually being able to publish some of the work that we're doing, other organisations have come forward and wanted to work with us. We have a lot of neighbours, as I say, 7 million neighbours, majority of those private householders, but the other organisations as well coming forward and doing work with them. Thank you, Jane. Next one. And a lot of that is due to the new amounts of data that we're getting. So this is just a quick slide to show that we have done a lot of work with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. We have now mapped the whole of our estate using Sentinel-2 data and the land cover mapping that CEH have been doing for a number of years now. And we've split the network into 21 different habitat types aligned with the UK HABs classification. And if you go on to the next slide, Jane, what you can see in this image is a short clip of the whole of the network. We have 1 kilometre buffer around the whole of the network, which shows us those habitat types. And the railway on that slide is a thin strip going down the middle, but we can zoom in. The pixel size is 10 metres by 10 metres. And so what we've been able to identify is the broad habitat type that we've got on our side of the fence, and then we can look at the associations that it's having with the wider landscape, and we can then start to work with those adjacent landowners to build up the connectivity, to help with nature recovery network, and actually look at areas where, for example, in this instance, the red is the woodland habitat, and we can see where we can start building up connections between woodlands that are already existing. The purple down to the bottom left-hand side is heathland, and it sort of shows that there is not as much heathland in that area. Can we assist with the management that we've got on our side of the fence? Can we assist how other local landowners might want to be doing that as well? So the next slide, please, Jim. And this timeline just shows the amount of work that's happened since Joe Johnson and John Varley got involved back in 2018. We've had the review published. We've rebriefed to our staff the breeding bird guidance, which was one of the key reasons for the review starting off in the first place. We've had the DFT policy statement. We've launched programs. We've got the standards updated. We've joined in with international railway projects looking at biodiversity, and we've published Network Rail's environment sustainability strategy as well, and got our biodiversity action plan and the biodiversity standards published. And the review was short in terms of its completed within 6 months, and we've managed to get all that work done within 2 years. And we haven't stopped there. We are moving forward. And the next slide, please, Jane. What we're looking to do is then take that forward. Now, in terms of achievements, and I think we've gone a long way from where we were 2 years ago. Biodiversity is now one of the 4 main pillars that we have in our strategy. We've got that biodiversity action plan and targets that we now have to meet as part of policy, but also within a strategy of biodiversity net gain by 2035. We've got people actively wanting to come and work with us because of the data we've got, because of the opportunity that our land holding and our estate has. And we've got the data. We are now able to make management decisions that are based on the science, based on actually what is on the ground, and we can then monitor and manage that and move forward, which will help us achieve our targets. And all of that, being able to talk about it and publish works is actually promoting discussion and showing that, what is the art of the possible. And hopefully this, can go outside of the rail industry and assist with other people. And I think now that we can move on to some questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Neil, and Jane and John. Absolutely fascinating to hear about the project and how much has been achieved in such a short time. It's amazing. And it has generated quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with one from Kat, and it says, John, you stated that you had to get nature viewed as an asset. How did you quantify that in economic terms, or can nature only be valued within a well-being index, such as the one in New Zealand?
Oh, right. Thank you. Good question. I don't know about the Wellbeing Index in New Zealand. I think I might have heard of it, but I don't know exactly what it is. A very good question, and that's one of the things we struggled a bit with Network Rail, because they like sort of tangible targets. But there's a heck of a lot of work being done. I think Neil has really explained where they've taken it, so they can measure nature both as a metric, as a target. There's a whole principle of something called natural capital, which takes not just nature, but a whole range of other ecosystem services into account. So there's a huge amount of measurement of biodiversity, of environmental benefits, which was actually being developed in parallel at the same time nationally as we were doing our review. So what Network Rail have actually done is picked up on a lot of that and are now becoming, as Neil's hinted at, leaders in it. So I do believe it's possible to measure nature. You need to identify exactly what components you're talking about, and nature in its widest sense is a difficult thing to measure. But once you break it down into key areas of biodiversity or environment or ecology, ecosystems, you can measure it. And that, I think, Neil has quite clearly showed with the Centre of Hydrology how they're doing that.
Thank you, John. There's another question which kind of links to it from Janet, and it says, what does net gain mean in the context of the point about moving biodiversity to net gain?
Okay, so in its simplest form, people, observers viewed what Network Rail was doing, chopping down trees, as destroying biodiversity. And so if somebody builds a housing estate or Network Rail chops some trees down and they build a housing estate in a greenfield site, the view is that they're destroying biodiversity. So in general terms, people, organizations and people have set targets to, if you're doing that kind of development or activity, to no net loss. So no net loss, you go and plant another tree somewhere else, for example. You chop a tree down, you plant another one somewhere else. No net loss, that's another tree. No net and net gain is doing no net loss plus something else. So you're actually delivering even more than you had in the first place. And this principle of net gain put fear and trepidation in the hands of Taylor Wimpey and all the big builders and developers, because they have to spend even more and demonstrate that somehow to the planning authority and to others that they're generating more. But that's where the planning world is going, net gain in biodiversity. And when we put this term into Network Rail's challenge, Department of Transport got really quite irritated about it and said, this is all about houses. And so I had not quite a stand-up row, but I had a very interesting conversation with a very senior civil servant to say, if you'd step over the road to Noble House where DEFRA is, it's in part of the government's 25-year plan. And that soon changed their mindset. And we now go beyond net gain of biodiversity to net environmental gain, which takes biodiversity, and Neil was hinting at this, you know, we're not just about biodiversity, it's the whole other aspects of environment, like water quality, air quality, etc. And that's net environmental gain. That's an even bigger challenge. But these challenges are facing the country. And if Network Rail wants to be seen as valued by society and adding value, it needs to be tackling these issues and these subjects like any other organisation, I would suggest.
We've got another question. Well, it's more of a statement really from Emily, probably one for Neil. It suggests there's also more understanding happening with vegetation management around stopping landslides and flooding. Do you want to comment on that one?
Yes, I mean, it sort of ties into John's previous question. What we need to work out is what we've got, and that's where the work we're doing with UKCEH is going to help us with that. And it's those management decisions to make sure that we know where those locations are that have the potential for flooding risk. We know the types of vegetation that we've already got growing on those slopes. And then it's the decisions that can be then made by the geotechnical experts, the drainage engineers, and then the people who are managing the biodiversity to make sure that it's the right decision that's made for that habitat type. And then we can then manage it going forward. So it's what we're collecting is the data, and having that data will enable us to make those right decisions. And that's key. That's where we've not been before, because we've not known exactly what biodiversity we've got.
That's fascinating that the data is really beginning to drive and inform the decision making. A question for Jane from Catherine. Did you use the survey to identify your stakeholders, or were there other methods used, and how did the survey go viral?
So we actually didn't use the survey to identify the stakeholders, but we used it afterwards so that we were sure that we could cover the whole range of stakeholders that that we wanted to reach out to actually understand what their views were. And it went viral because there was one stakeholder within the working groups who actually put it on LinkedIn or Twitter, and that was it. Overnight, it went from, we were just about to close, it went from about 200 to about, I don't know, 5,500, which was a bit scary overnight. So it was just one person posting it on Twitter, and then they obviously had a loud voice, and then it went completely viral. So yeah, watch out for that one.
The power of social media. I've got a question from David. Fascinating lecture, thank you. I'm keen to understand that by increasing the biodiversity adjacent to the railway, what impact has been seen with the interaction of moving trains and the fauna living within the area, and how is this managed? One for you, Neil, I think.
I'm assuming that's possibly the impact of the trains on the animals, and we are, the work we're doing with the UIC, which is the International Railway Union, and colleagues in railways in Europe. They have a lot more wild animals which are a lot larger than ones that we have on in England, Wales and Scotland, and so they're very keen on making sure that the things like the migration routes are still able for animals to move around safely without causing safety risks with trains. We haven't seen a marked increase in the numbers of animals causing issues, wild animals that is. We know that there is challenges with the third rail, which is where the electrification is at ground level. And you know, we do have the only 2 otters I've seen in the UK have been ones that have unfortunately died because of the electrification in the southeast of England. So it is a problem, but hopefully we will, once we know, again, it comes down to knowing what we've got and where it is, we can then start to look at whether we need to assist those animals in crossing the railway in slightly different ways than we have normally.
Thank you.
That's the question.
And then probably another one for you from Rob. What's the future strategy of educating the line-side neighbours that it's okay to remove trees and vegetation? And as the survey said, is it seen as a pure destruction and not something that's beneficial?
It's I don't think I want to be seen to be trying to teach people what is right and wrong. What we need to demonstrate is that we are managing our estate in a way that is better and that actually can show the improvements, so that we can show that there is a benefit from the way that we're doing the work, so that we can have that railway safety, that we can have the biodiversity, and again comes back to the data. If we're able to collect the data to show that there is a change, there is an improvement, then that's the way that we, rather than educating, it's just demonstrating, I think is probably the better way to do it. And you know, we're all mindful, everybody sat at home at the moment watching, you know, their computer screens, and it is fundamental to be able to, for people to be able to see that green stuff, using a rather technical phrase. And you know, we have that, we are custodian of a lot of it, and we just need to make sure that we manage it in the correct way. And I think if we do that and we're able to show that there's an improvement, then that's the best way to do that.
Yeah. I think we've got time just for one more quick question. Considering some of the high-profile forestry works around the HS2 programme, how do you see the future infrastructure projects adequately considering its impact on the natural environment? We've actually only got 1 minute to answer that question, so if anyone wants to have a quick go.
Well, I mean, absolutely. In ancient woodlands, HS2, the big debate. We just need to value this stuff. You can't replace ancient woodlands. And the point, just looking at that picture on the screen, if you remove those trees and replaced it with the habitats of the past at the side of the railway, I would like to put some money on the fact that we're more biodiversity and more valuable, inverted commas, biodiversity for the nation than there is living in that stuff that there's at the moment. A tree doesn't necessarily mean biodiversity. However, ancient woodland is very special and cannot be replaced. So I just think people who do large infrastructure projects need to bear this in mind. and they need to engage with the communities of interest and explain to them what's going on, because unless you do that, you're going to get a polarized position like we found us, or I found myself in, and the situation HS2 and other large infrastructure projects. But it doesn't have to be like that.
Thank you, John, and well done. That was less than a minute. So we're really at the end of our time now, and I'd just like to say a really big thank you to our speakers. Absolutely fascinating to hear about the project and the amount that's been achieved in such a short time, to see the results of things actually changing what's happening on the ground. It's fantastic. Just a quick plug for our next events with the APM South East branch. Just keep an eye out for PM in the Shed on the 2nd of March, and a presentation about data and data within projects towards the end of April. And once again, really big thank you to our speakers. Absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you. Thanks, John, and cheerio, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.